EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. It's the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Those of you who have questions about the Catholic faith, please feel free to consider us as a kind of a primary source to get those questions answered. I know a lot of people have questions about the Catholic faith. Please turn to us. We're here for you. Here's that phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. And, of course, you can always send us an email. The address for that, ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer, Matt Kavinsky our phone screener, Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, you can do that. Put your question in the comments box because we're streaming right now. Jeff will see that, and then he'll shoot it to us here in the studio. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, sir?
You know, I'm doing decent, thank you.
Haven't had a lunch update in a while.
You know, it's been pretty boring for me recently. It's just lentils pretty much every day for like the last month.
Well, at least you're admitting that it's boring.
I mean, it's not boring to me. I enjoy them.
You're enjoying
not
it.
a lot to talk about, just lentils and copious herbs and spices.
That makes it more interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
So here's an anonymous email to lead us off today. This person says, "Hello, I recently heard a new term, or at least new to me, disparity of cult. It points to difficulties that can arise in a mixed faith marriage. I think it's even a phrase in canon law. I don't remember this ever being discussed in my Catholic upbringing, yet it tells the truth. Could you please explain disparity of cult? Thank you, Anonymous."
Yeah, thanks. So this is something the Church has recognized basically from the first century, and St. Paul writes about it in his first letter to the Corinthians, the difficulties that can emerge from when husband and wife don't share the same religion. And in fact, there is a situation, the so-called Pauline privilege, where it's the only time the dissolution of the bond of marriage, one of the only times the dissolution of the bond of marriage is actually permitted in the Catholic Church, and that is when you have two pagans, one becomes Catholic, and then the remaining pagan spouse will not tolerate the Catholicism of the converting spouse. That spouse is actually not bound to that marriage.
Wow.
So you can have that dissolved. So it's something that the Church has thought about for a long time. And when two Christians are baptized, their marriage is a sacrament. And thus it's an ecclesial state, like being a priest or being a Catholic religious, a monk or a nun or something like that. And your marriage has a role, has a function in the Church's economy and its organization and its ministry to the world. So you're signing on for that when you're a Christian person. Well, it's that can become very complex if you're a Catholic person and you're in a sacramental marriage, and let's say you have a Presbyterian or a Baptist spouse, and they're like, "Yeah, I'm not on board with this sacramental marriage thing," because virtually no Protestants, maybe some Anglicans, believe that marriage is a sacrament, and certainly don't think it's connected somehow intrinsically to the identity and organization of the Catholic Church. Well, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
I mean, living out your vocation as a Catholic person in a sacramental marriage that's allied to the Church and part of its essential structure and function. When it comes to raising your children, a disparity of cult can be a big problem. I mean, the number one rule for raising kids, this is my own personal opinion here, but it's relevant, is lots of different parenting styles can work, but one, and that is the divided parents.
Yeah.
Right? When mom and dad agree, they can work out almost anything. When mom and dad don't agree, it destroys their moral authority.
Yeah.
And so when the question of religion comes up, if dad says, "I'm a Catholic," and mom says, "Catholics are wrong, I'm a Presbyterian," what the kid takes away from that is that, well, nobody's right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean it can never work, and there are obviously plenty of examples of people in mixed marriages where the children have been brought up in the faith and it's all turned out okay. But that's kind of the exception and not the rule. And so for this reason, the church says we don't normally approve mixed marriages like this. You can get a dispensation from the bishop to allow it, and usually that's granted. But you have to go through the steps, because you have to think hard about what you're undertaking, and you will have troubles in life if you go this route. Doesn't mean you can't. It doesn't mean it can't end successfully, but it is asking for difficulties.
Thanks so much for your email. Chris checked in with us on YouTube actually yesterday. Couldn't get it answered on the show, so here it is. Hopefully, Chris, you are listening today. Chris says, do all Catholics have to get along? If we have a conflict that has been tried to be resolved, but with no success, do we have to keep trying?
Yeah, thank you. Well, you're not obligated to stand there and let someone else hit you in the head with a hammer over and over again. You're not obligated to do that. And I think that you, right? That's a sound rule of moral theology. Where you have no power, you have no responsibility. You can maintain a willingness to be reconciled and an openness to that, without assuming that the entire responsibility for effecting reconciliation lies on you. If you stated your intent, hey, I'm sorry, or I forgive you, let's be friends, and the other side refuses your overtures, that's really not on you anymore.
Okay, very good. And to Chris, thanks again for your question via YouTube. Here's one now from Marcus, who says, in the New Testament, there are two lineages of Jesus, one the Gospel of Matthew, the other in the Gospel of Luke. I heard an evangelical preacher say one is from the lineage of Joseph and the other is from the lineage of Mary. Could you please clarify this?
Yeah, sure. So that is an interpretation that has been offered in church history, right? And why would you want to have Joseph's lineage? Well, he's Jesus' adopted father.
Yeah.
And so, legal status could be derived in that way as well as through natural birth.
Okay, then there you go. Thanks again for your question. That is from San Antonio. All right, there it is. I finally figured out what is SA, and I'm going, South Australia? No, San Antonio. Now we've got it. Thanks again for your question. In a moment, we're going to go to Italy, but it'll be Italy, Texas, and talk with Lisa, also Kate in Marietta, Ohio, and hopefully we'll be hearing from you today, and that number is 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986. What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about it here on EWTN's Call to Communion.
If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
Hi, I'm Doug Keck. This is an EWTN bookmark brief, speaking with Janet Morana about her book, Everything You Need to Know About Abortion for Teens. What do you say to people who say, well, Roe v. Wade's overturned, isn't this all passé now, or why are we still fighting? What are we fighting about?
First of all, it's not passé. It just took it out of the judicial branch of the government, put it in legislative, and it's not just the states, it's also federal. Therefore, the battle still rages on, and we're not going to stop until we make abortion unthinkable, that people just don't want to buy the bad product of abortion and go away from it altogether.
What's been the response to the book so far?
They really like the chapters on the exceptions, rape, incest, life of the mother, fetal anomaly, because those are the things that they get hit from the other side. Like, what about this and what about that? And they like the idea that I gave them talking points and real information and statistics and studies to kind of combat those arguments.
Thank you so much, Janet Morano, author of Everything You Need to Know About Abortions for Teens. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on another Bookmark Brief.
It's the Thursday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, we have a couple of lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Before we go to the phones, let me tell you about something beautiful now available from EWTN's religious catalog. It's the Holy Family Nativity Gold Frame. It's a 2x3 gold frame, a beautiful piece, easily carried in a purse or a backpack or a briefcase. With a vintage appearance, baby Jesus curled up in the hay, eyes closed in sleep. Mary and Joseph stand nearby, watching their son at rest. This beautiful gold-stamped Italian art print is framed under glass in an ornate golden frame with an easel back. Again, 2 inches by 3 inches. It's imported from Italy. Check it out by going to EWTNRC.com. And if you want to look at the actual image, see what it's all about, just put in Holy Family Nativity Gold Frame, and I'm sure it'll pop up. EWTNRC.com. Speaking of Italy, let's go to Lisa, a first-time caller in Italy, Texas, listening on the Great Guadalupe Radio. Hey, Lisa, what's on your mind today?
Well, I needed some help, and I thought, who better to call? I've been listening to you for a while now. My husband has done this throughout our marriage, and I am shocked. On our anniversary this year, December 31st, he calls me by his ex-wife's name. He's introduced me by his ex-wife's name throughout the marriage, and he has called me numerous times her name. And I really was shaken up on our anniversary.
I am so sorry. Lisa, I am so sorry. I can't even imagine how painful that's got to be.
Yeah.
I am so sorry. I've got a question for you about this, however. Do you think he does this out of malice, or is it possible he has some kind of neurological deficiency?
I hope it's neurological, because I don't think he's a hateful man or a vengeance type man.
And when you've asked him about this, what does he say?
He left the room when he did it this time. And before, he said it was because we were having conversation that had brought her name up, or the children's name up that they had, and that he just fell back into that. He at a wedding ceremony, he introduced me. This is my wife. I won't say her name.
Yeah,
and I like her.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the children. I like her. But I'm still shaken after we dated 8 years and then now married 25 years.
So,
and I'm wondering,
is there anything else in his behavior that would strike an objective observer as odd? Does he have other kind of verbal or mental tics or oddities about his personality?
Quirky things,
Quirky
maybe?
things. You know, I'm trying to get at the root. I'm not a psychologist or anything by the stretch of imagination, but I have a lot of like people in my family who are not neurotypical, and I'm used to quirky behavior, and I've come to have a certain kind of tolerance for folks who are not exactly wired like the rest of us.
Sure.
And I'm trying to figure out if that description fits your husband, or if this is just malice on his part.
I really, in my heart of heart, I don't think he does it intentionally. He sometimes just goes on and doesn't even realize he has even done it.
How long was he married to this woman?
16 years.
Okay, well,
They dated.
You know, I don't know if this will help at all, but, you know, my name's David. I have uncles named Bruce and Harry. I've got a brother named Lou. I grew up with a dog named Happy. I have been called all of those things by my own mother, right? She still does it. I'm 52 years old, and from time to time she'll call me after her brother's name, either one of her brothers. Once or twice she's called me by my brother's name, and I've even been addressed as the dog.
So have I, by my own mother, who called me Snoopy several times.
And I know that in her case it's not malice.
Yeah.
I know it is. It's just a neurological habit pattern that she's not even conscious of. But because none of those names have this particular association, it's not painful to me. It's just kind of, for me, it's amusing because, it's funny to be called after your dog, but it's just an accident. But if it's an ex-spouse, I can see that would be just tremendously painful. if what you're telling me is accurate and this is not done on purpose and it's not done in malice, then I would write it off personally to, this is just kind of a little brain quirk of a deeply entrenched pattern that he's not even conscious of, and recognize that he loves you and he's faithful to you and he doesn't want to hurt you, and you know where his heart is, and you can appeal to him that, look, this is very important to me that you don't do this. Please, please, please try to pay attention and be conscious of this habit, because it's really painful to me each time you do it. Other than that, I don't think there's much you can do here. As long as you're persuaded of his sincerity to you, then that's where I would put my attention. I'd remember, I'll tell you a little story on myself. I think I put this kind of stuff in my book, so I'm not giving away any family secrets.
Okay.
My wife and I love each other, but we are very different kinds of people. We are motivated by different things. We're interested in different things. We have very different talents. We bring different things to the marriage and to the care of our family, right? And if you've listened to me, I'm a bookish kind of fellow. I like to quote books. I like to read books and have ideas. And I'll tell you, the fastest way to put my wife to sleep is to say, "Can I tell you about a book I'm reading?" I mean, just off she goes. She's right out of there,
Uh-huh.
And for years, I used to try to share some of my more speculative ideas with her, and she would say, "Okay, I'm gonna make a really good faith effort to pay attention," and it wouldn't last 30 seconds, and then baby cries, the phone rings, the dog barks, and it's out of here. And I used to really get my feelings hurt, right? Like, why is this woman not paying attention to what's important to me? And then I realized, we're just cut out a completely different cloth, and I'm asking her to do something that is very, very unnatural to her interests. And to be honest, I guess I have some of the same faults, trying to think. I mean, there are things at the house that she's asked me to do for 30 years. Please do this. Don't leave this thing hanging out on the counter, and please put that up in the right place. And I keep goofing up. Right? I keep making the same. My mother used to get on me when I was a kid because she'd say, "Did you take the towels upstairs when you went upstairs?" "No, I didn't know there were any towels." "Well, David, I put them right in the middle of the stairs. You had to step over them to get upstairs." "Sorry, Mom, I guess I stepped over them." And part of living with each other is learning to accommodate people who they just go through life at a different speed than we do.
Sure. Lisa, we hope that's helpful for you. God bless you, Lisa, and thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. We have one line open at 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Going to Marietta now, and Kate, listening in Marietta, Ohio on the great St. Paul Radio. Hello, Kate. What's on your mind today?
Yes, hello. I have a question. I have a Protestant friend who insists that the Catholic Mass is a ritual sacrifice, a re-sacrifice of Christ on the cross over and over every time we do that. He's saying that this is heretical and that Christ died once and that was all that was necessary and that it shouldn't be done, and I don't know how to answer him.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So he's half right and half wrong. And we need to clear up the half that he's right and the half that he's wrong.
All right.
Unambiguously, the Mass is a sacrifice. That is clearly the teaching of the Scriptures, and it's clearly the teaching of the Church. The Mass is a sacrifice. So that half he's got right. Here's what he's got wrong. We don't immolate Christ. He is not killed, nor do we think that the sacrifice of Calvary was insufficient. So the question is, what is the mode of Christ's sacrifice in the Mass? And I would direct you or anyone else who's interested to the encyclical Mediator Dei by Pope Pius XII, where he says, and this is a quotation, I'm using his words, these are the Pope's words,
Okay.
that the sacrifice of Christ in the Mass is symbolic. Now, I did not say the presence of Christ was symbolic. I said the death of Christ is represented symbolically. He's really present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, through transubstantiation. But his death is not really present in a similar manner. He died once on Calvary. He doesn't ever die again. So how is the death present in the Mass? And what the Pope teaches, and what St. Thomas teaches, and what St. Augustine teaches, and what the Fathers taught, is that the double consecration of bread and wine represent Christ's body and blood in a state of separation, in a state of victimhood, i.e. death. And the reason we have bread and wine to become the true presence of Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity is because in their separate states, the two species show forth, they demonstrate, they symbolize the separation of Christ's body from blood, which took place at Calvary. And that is why the language of the Mass itself, if you attend to the Eucharistic prayer, the priest speaks of the Mass as the memorial of Christ's death and resurrection. And so the death of Christ is shown forth, but it is not re-effected. We don't actually kill Jesus again. That would be, first of all, impossible, and second, blasphemous, because his death on Calvary was completely sufficient to do what the death on Calvary was meant to do, right? But now let's go a little bit deeper. Some Protestants object even to this, because they say that even a ritual sacrifice without a bloody immolation, even that is too much. But that you shouldn't even do that. You should just reflect on the one sacrifice, and you shouldn't ritually reenact it in the Mass. But the Scriptures tell us that actual sacrifice is essential to the Christian life. In the book of Romans, chapter 12, Paul says, "You are to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. This is your spiritual act of worship." When Jesus says in John 4 that the Father seeks true worshipers who will worship him in spirit and in truth, St. Paul says that worship in spirit and in truth, the spiritual act or rational act of worship, is the offering of ourselves in living sacrifices. So the idea that the death of Christ eliminates all future sacrifice is contradicted by the express words of Scripture. It is essential that we offer sacrifice, but we don't have to offer the sacrifice of Calvary again, right? The Mass itself is a distinct oblation, as is the entire Christian life. Whenever we offer things of value, including ourselves, and especially the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ in the Eucharist, we do something meritorious. Jesus said, if you offer even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, that this is meritorious. He says, if you give a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because they belong to me, you will not lose your reward, i.e., it is meritorious, right? So the idea that the death of Christ eliminates merit, eliminates sacrifice, eliminates offering, that's totally contradicted by the words in the New Testament. St. Paul says, I fill up in my own flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. That's Paul's language. That's New Testament language there. That we can participate in the death of Christ by offering ourselves, offering our sacrifices, offering our gifts, and ritually offering the body and blood of Christ in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Paul uses this language in 1 Corinthians when he says that those who share in the altar of Christ share in his death in a sacrificial manner, right? So this is biblical teaching. This is traditional teaching. The Protestant who objects to this does so without strong biblical warrant, and usually with a misunderstanding of what the sacrifice of the Mass consists in. Now, there is one place in sacred Scripture where we are forbidden to crucify Jesus again, and it is Hebrews chapter 6, verse 6. And this actually contradicts the Protestant perspective. The book of Hebrews says that if you fall away again into sin, falling away again into sin is the re-crucifixion of Jesus that is blasphemy. So there is an illegitimate way of crucifying Christ over and over again, and it is by turning back to sin, not by the sacrifice of the Mass. Now, Protestant doctrine, at least in the Lutheran and Calvinist traditions, denies this, and it asserts that Christians continually sin mortally every day because of their total depravity. And yet the book of Hebrews says it's that It's that grave sin, turning back to grave sin, that is the illegitimate re-crucifying of Jesus, not the ritual offering, the memorial of his death and resurrection that we present in the holy sacrifice of the Mass.
There you go, Kate. Thanks so much for your call, and hope that's helpful for you and for your friend. You may want to refer your friend to our podcast. Charles will have that posted for you, in the next hour or so, maybe an hour and a half. It takes a while for the podcast to actually go online. The address for that is EWTNradio.net, EWTNradio.net, and then once you're there, click on the word podcast, and you should see it. In a moment, we'll talk with Lamar driving through Florida, also JJ in Omaha. A couple of lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion. Stay with us.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
This is Ryan Penny. My panel of guests this week on the Catholic Sphere includes social media experts Keith Downey, Jordan Burke, and Lauren DeWitt, discussing their roles as new evangelists and the future of Catholic social media.
The Catholic Sphere, Sunday afternoon, 2:30 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Want to be notified when Called to Communion goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
Join Archbishop Jose Gomez in sharing the good news.
Jesus left his footprints when he walked on this earth, and he's calling all of us now, each in our way, to walk in his footsteps, to follow his path of love. And he promises us that if we answer his call, then we will know love and joy, beauty, goodness, and truth. Our lives will become a pathway of love that leads to heaven and eternal life. Jesus wants us to do great things with our lives, and he's calling us to use our gifts and talents to proclaim his kingdom and to save souls, to create a beautiful society that is open to God and that serves human dignity and social justice. Let's ask for the grace to live our faith with confidence and joy, serving God with all our hearts.
Visit lacatholics.org to find ways to connect with our faith community in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
Hi, this is Cy Keller. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, we've got Jimmy Aiken, Open Forum, Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's Called to Communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If I could, I'd like to put in a personal plug for a special broadcast we have for you coming up a week from tomorrow. It is our annual coverage of the March for Life from Washington, D.C. We've been doing this since the inception of the March for Life practically. And many people say, well, Roe versus Wade has been overturned. Well, you know what? If you think about it, the reason for the March for Life is more important than ever. And you'll hear exclusive coverage of this on EWTN radio and television beginning at 8 a.m. Eastern on Friday. That is a week from tomorrow. All right, back to the phones right now at 833-288-EWTN. Lamar driving through Florida, listening to us on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hello, Lamar. What's on your mind today?
Good afternoon, gentlemen, and thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I was coming home from a family gathering, and at that family gathering, we were sitting down saying evening prayer, liturgy of the hours, and we had a Protestant family member participating. So when the prayers concluded, that particular family member said, "Why do you Catholics not say, 'For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory,' after you say the Our Father?" He said, "We say it every time we say the Our Father." So I said, I'll propose this to Dr. Anders. He should know.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. Yeah, thank you so much. So there are divergent textual traditions about this, East and West in Christian history. This phrase does not occur in the Latin Vulgate translation of the New Testament, Matthew 6:13, and it doesn't appear in the writings of several of the early church fathers, many Latin, but also Greek. So you don't find it in Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, Ambrose, or Augustine, right? That's not in those texts. It's missing from some early Greek manuscripts, although it's in the majority of Greek manuscripts, but not all of them. And so in the Latin tradition, it's not traditional, and it's not in the Latin translations of the Bible. So it's probable, and of course this is all speculative, it's probable that the text, that this phrase was added to some Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. There are at least divergent manuscripts traditions. And this is the older liturgical formula, right? And so the liturgical use in the Catholic tradition matches what's probably apostolic tradition here. Now, there's nothing theologically incorrect about the doxology, right? And you know, it's when my Protestant friends say it, I'm like, well, you know, more power to you. Great, you know, that's fine, that's wonderful, but it's not mandatory, and it's not the Catholic way, and it isn't traditional in the Latin Church. And there's some manuscript and early textual evidence to support that that's the older usage.
Okay, is that helpful for you, Lamar?
Yeah, that's helpful from a Catholic standpoint, I believe. But so why is it part of Protestant doctrine that they have to say that every time?
Okay, so that raises an interesting question. And that's how do you establish what Protestant doctrine even is? Okay, and in Protestantism, you know, the doctrine, the principal rule is sola scriptura, that whatever the Bible says, that's what we do, and what the Bible doesn't say, it's a matter of indifference, or we leave it out. And so Protestants are much more interested in the question of manuscripts of the Bible than Catholics are, right? So, for example, this is not the Lord's Prayer. Let's take another issue, the long ending of Mark. Mark 16 has a long ending and a short ending, and you find different manuscript traditions with one or the other ending. The longer ending is the one that says, these signs will accompany those who believe. They'll drink deadly poisons and pick up serpents and speak in tongues and so forth. When I was in seminary, in the Protestant seminary, I had a New Testament professor who made the claim that the long ending of Mark was, careful now, not canonical. That was his word, not canonical.
Okay.
Because it wasn't in the earliest manuscripts, and therefore the author of Mark didn't write it. It was something that some later scribe had added. That was his position. And it wasn't until I was Catholic, but I began to puzzle about that, and I thought, well, since when does canonicity depend upon the higher critical determination of who wrote what when, right? Because from a Catholic point of view, it's perfectly conceivable that one author wrote Mark 1 to, you know, the first half of 16, and author added the second half of Mark 16. Both of them got incorporated into the tradition, and the Church recognizes the final complete product as canonical, right? It's the authority of the Church that determines canonicity, not some higher critical scholar's view of, you know, what was the original version, right? Most biblical books underwent considerable development over time. It's why we can find like multiple versions of Isaiah existing in the Qumran manuscripts and so forth. That's really not determinative for Catholic faith. What's the ecclesiastical version that was finally settled on by the Church? That's the canonical version, right? And so within Protestantism, there is a tradition of preferring certain manuscript traditions, right? This is a question of biblical scholarship and of liturgical practice. But I find the arguments a bit ad hoc. So, I mean, I could just as easily see an iconoclastic Protestant scholar saying, hey, we should stop doing this because it's not in these early manuscripts. You know, and I also think there could be a fair bit of, well, the Catholics do it this way, so we should do it the other way.
Always that. Hey, Lamar, thanks so much for your call. Do appreciate that. Drive carefully there in Florida. Let's go now to JJ, a first-time caller in Omaha, listening today on YouTube. Hey, hello, JJ. What's on your mind today, sir?
Oh, thank you so much for taking my call, gentlemen. Bless you. And I just had a comment, I guess, on the topic. I was raised in a Catholic household, not strict, but a Catholic household. In my adult life, I don't consider myself Catholic. I'm not practicing. And your question posed sort of got me thinking, why am I not a Catholic? I'm a spiritual person. I definitely believe in a lot of the aspects. I just thought to myself, and as I sat here and thought about it, I guess I came up with one answer that I think makes the best sense to me. I guess probably the main reason I'm not is because of the priests having sex with kids all the time.
Yeah, that's a real big scandalous thing, isn't it?
It is.
That really is. I think that's a lot of people, of course, have been profoundly scandalized by the bad behavior of clergy. And, I myself am a convert to the Catholic Church. I didn't grow up Catholic. I grew up Presbyterian. I became Catholic 20 years ago when I was, in my early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you that when I became Catholic, that was when the real depth of the clerical abuse scandal was hitting the public media. This was around 2002, 2003. And it did not deter me from becoming Catholic, really even for a second. And that might shock you. The reason it didn't deter me is that even as a non-Catholic, even as somebody who grew up very anti-Catholic, I recognized that behavior was not characteristic of most clergy. It was characteristic of, widespread abuse by a few clergy who did outsized, disproportionate damage to the church and to thousands of people, and to some bishops that tried to cover up for them, right? But my perspective on the Catholic Church was one framed by 2,000 years of history. And so my motive to become Catholic was, look, I certainly don't want to go to Mass with one of these scandalous priests. I don't want them in my life at all. But that's easily avoidable.
Sure.
And rather, I want to join the Catholic Church because I want to be in fellowship with this 2,000-year tradition and the great saints down through the centuries. And I'll have to say that my experience in the Catholic Church for 20 years now has been that the majority of the clergy with whom I have been personally acquainted and have ministered directly to my family has been entirely positive and sometimes overwhelmingly positive. And in my 20-year history in the Diocese of Birmingham, there hasn't been a single case that I know of clerical scandal like this at all. And, so I do recognize that it's happened. And I recognize that there are some structural reasons why. And I also work for the diocese now and have some knowledge of the steps that have been taken to prevent these kinds of things from happening again. But I certainly understand your reticence, and I also find it just as repulsive. Now, also to put a little bit of perspective on it, there's a woman by the name of Carol Shakeshaft who did a study for Hofstra University a number of years ago where she looked at the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church and compared it to sexual abuse in other public institutions, like certain school districts in large states that are very far to the west of me, and found that the rates of sexual abuse of children in some of these school districts was actually higher than the rates of abuse that took place in the Catholic Church, but didn't generate nearly the kind of media attention because taking down those institutions wasn't as interesting to the people that were making those accusations, right? I went to a non-Catholic high school. It was a very secular institution. And a few years ago, I had some communication from the administration that they were undergoing a review of, their past history and asking for information about, whether anybody had been mistreated. And I contributed some information to that survey myself, and the results of it came out a few years later, and a number of longtime faculty got the axe ignominiously because of discovery of, many of them had died and passed on, but that they were forthcoming with the information that, hey, this abuse happened, and these few people had sort of a disproportionate bad influence and mistreatment, abuse of this large number of students, and it generated a little drip in the pond of news media around here, but it wasn't a national scandal because it wasn't the Catholic Church. This kind of thing unfortunately happens in society across institutions. It's happened in the Catholic Church. That's terrible, but it doesn't mark the Church out as being uniquely bad. It happens in Catholic agencies. It happens in Protestant agencies. It happens in secular agencies. It happens in anti-Catholic agencies. And I think it's a function of the sinfulness of the human person and the degradation of a few, but not necessarily characteristic of the whole.
JJ, thanks so much for your call. Appreciate hearing from you. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. We do have an opportunity to get a few more calls in if you want to call right now at 833-288-EWTN. Hopefully we can get you on today's program. 833-288-3986. This weekend, tomorrow evening on EWTN News in Depth, we'll be looking at the top legal, social, and political issues impacting the church. A special broadcast breaking down the key stories of 2022 that we'll be tracking in this new year of 2023. Do check it out, EWTN News in Depth, with your host, Montse Alvarado. That's tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. Eastern, on EWTN Radio and television. Here's an email we received from Joan. She says, I understood you to say that Mary was incapable of sinning. Well, my understanding of incapable would be that she was created without a free will. Saying it that way decreases, that is, the value of her fiat. She had to be capable of sinning in order for her life without sin to have such great value.
Incorrect.
Okay.
Incorrect.
Right.
Is God capable of sin?
I wouldn't think so.
Is God free?
Yes.
Is God freer than we are?
Yes.
He's constrained by nothing. He's constrained by nothing, and yet utterly incapable of sin. Was Jesus Christ capable of sin?
I would say no.
Was he free?
Very free.
Absolutely, right. So think of it this way. Who is the least free person? The least free person is the person that has absolutely no control over their own activity. They're utterly compelled by the necessity of their own, by the exigencies of their own passions. And I think the paradigm case in modern society would be the drug addict.
Mm.
The drug addict is absolutely incapable of not using drugs. They're obsessively, compulsively drawn to the drugs. If you cure of that compulsion, and in fact, perhaps they become so habituated to the life of virtue that the appeal of drugs has completely vanished and is now utterly repulsive to them. Would you say that person is less free than the drug addict?
Mm.
They're far freer.
Sure.
Right? Because, see, whenever you act, you always act for a motive. You're always going to act under the description of some good. It's either going to be some short-term irrational good, like, the good of bodily pleasure or pride or whatever, or it's going to be some transcendent good, some long-term good, something for the common good. But you're never going to act randomly without purpose. And so freedom in classical Catholic philosophy has much more to do with the freedom to act for those noble transcendent purposes and freedom from the compulsive urge to sin, just the way that an addict cured of his addiction has now become infinitely freer.
Mm-hmm.
And even as Jesus was free, even as God himself is free. And so was Mary free? Yes, absolutely. When she was sitting down to make dinner for the Holy Family, she was utterly free. I read the other day, actually, from some New Testament archaeology, that one of the most popular dishes in first century Judea was a kind of quiche.
Really?
Yeah, the archaeologists have dug up these clay casseroles, and they can see the residue of egg and vegetable pudding in there. Right?
Wow!
It wasn't indigenous to Judea; it was an import from other cultures. But at that time, it had become quite popular to make quiche of one kind or another. So, Blessed Virgin saying, what did Jesus and Joseph want to eat tonight? I could make quiche. Or maybe, they're coming back with some fish. They were by the Sea of Galilee, and I could make fish. I could make quiche. I could make fish quiche, right? I got options.
Yeah.
She's free, right? Or she said, I want to spend a good deal of time in prayer today. I could pray in the morning. I could pray in the evening. I could pray in the afternoon, right? Maybe I'll go visit Elizabeth. Maybe I'll go visit Mary, the wife of Clopas. There's all kinds of good things I can do. I'm utterly free to choose them. But sin has absolutely no appeal for me. That's not a lack of freedom.
Beautiful. And Joan, thanks so much for your email. Here is Dave now in Cincinnati listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind today, sir?
Well, this program and how wonderful it is. I want to defend us Catholics because I'm Catholic.
Okay.
And I went to a Catholic school for 6 or 9 years, and there wasn't even a whisper of any sexual anything going on ever. And my question today is our misery the only thing we have that God did not give us?
Is our misery the only thing we have that God does not give us? Well, that's a good question. All right, so anything that we have that is substantial, right? And that would include, the details of our own sort of neurophysiology. God gave us, and so the capacity to feel sorrow, the capacity to mourn, the capacity for melancholy. All of those things are things that God gave us. Now, parsing out how much of that is natural and how much of that is the result of the wounds of original sin, I'm not going to go into that right now. Just credit that I recognize those distinctions. Now, what we do with those capacities is up to our freedom, and when our actions lack some conformity to right reason, so we're not talking about some sort of substantial presence, we're talking about an absence, we're talking about a privation. That's not a thing, it's the absence of a thing. And evil, moral evil in particular, takes that character. It's not a stuff, it's not a substance that God would create or not create and then hand to us. It's rather our rational, free, deliberative choice lacking some conformity to right reason that we call sin. Okay. Now, let's say that happens. Let's say, earlier in the show we were talking about drug addiction. Let's say that I make the choice, the free choice, the deliberative choice for the short-term pleasure of a drug-induced euphoria over the long-term good of church and family and civil society and health and well-being and rationality. I make that choice. If that choice makes me miserable, is my misery at that point an evil or a good? And I think I'd have to take the position that the misery itself was a good, because it's my physiology and my psychology that God gave me responding appropriately to an irrational choice that's brought wreck and ruin into my life. And for most addicts, without that misery, they're never going to get clean. It's the misery that prompts me to change.
Sure.
So I don't think I would necessarily say that the misery itself doesn't come from God. I think it's part of the system that he gave us that enables us to turn in revulsion from that which is ugly. Now, the choice to choose the addiction, to choose the drug abuse, to choose the intoxication, lacked the conformity to right reason, and that lack, that privation, which is no thing, flows from my own sinful choice and not from God.
Fascinating question, though.
Very good question.
Yeah, very good. Dave, thanks so much for checking in. Here is Kristen in Alaska, checking us out today on YouTube. Hello, Kristen. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for taking my call. Well, I'm Catholic, and my brother is Protestant of the Calvinist tradition, and we were having that conversation about faith and works. And then it kind of morphed into this conversation about the three-legged stool of the Catholic Church, how we believe in sacred scripture, sacred tradition, and the magisterium. And he said that Paul's letter to the Galatians is at odds with tradition and the magisterium, and that Catholics reinterpret God's word to include that because Paul was attacking belief in justification by works. And so I just wanted to get Dr. Anders' viewpoint on that. I know that I think Paul was trying to correct that Judaizer heresy, where Judaizers thought that they had to be circumcised and observe the law for salvation. And so I think he was trying to correct that in his letter to the Galatians. But I just wanted his viewpoint.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This is a goody question. I like these questions. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. So first thing I would say, kind of tongue-in-cheek to your brother, if he was talking to me and said, well, Galatians contradicts Catholic tradition and the Catholic magisterium, the first thing I would say is, okay, why is Galatians in your Bible? Who put it there? How do you know it's in the Bible? How do you know it should be in the Bible? How do you know it's inspired? How do you know Paul wrote it? Right? You're appealing to this text as an authority. Why? Who gave you that conviction? And the fact of the matter is he wouldn't even have a New Testament canon if the Catholic Church hadn't declared and promulgated this list of books as canonical. Right? Now, there were people in Paul's own day. There were Christians in Paul's own day. People associated with James in Jerusalem in Paul's own day. There were people that Paul preached to in Paul's own day that said, Paul, we want nothing to do with you. Get out of here. Go away. You're not even a real apostle. You didn't see Jesus. And Paul had to contend for his apostleship, right? So it's not obvious on the face of it that we should even treat Paul's letter as authoritative in any way. Maybe he's just some renegade, Jewish convert or thinker, and he's aberrant. He doesn't represent the original position of the apostles. There were those who held that in his own day, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
How do we come to a contrary judgment that we ought to even listen to what Paul has to say? It's only the authority of the Catholic Church that makes this judgment, that says, yes, no, Paul actually is an apostle. His letters are inspired. His books are canonical. So if you throw out Catholic tradition, you don't even get to a New Testament with Paul's letters.
Yeah,
right?
Start with that.
Start with that. That's number one. Number two, your response to your brother about the meaning of Galatians is exactly on point. Exactly on point. Paul's very clear in what the language of justification refers to in Romans and Galatians, the only two books in the New Testament that really talk about justification. And the context is obvious. Do Gentile converts who come to believe in Jesus have to follow the law of Moses in all its details? Do they have to circumcise themselves in particular? And Paul's emphatic answer to that question is no, they do not. And the language of justification and salvation by faith and not by works of the law pertains to this issue alone. Do Gentiles have to follow the whole law of Moses? Now, that was the interpretation of Paul for centuries before Luther. There's a wonderful doctoral dissertation by a guy named Matthew J. Thomas on the phrase works of the law, Paul's works of the law, in the theology of the 2nd century Christians. So when the very earliest Christians read St. Paul,
mm-hmm.
and they encountered this phrase, works of the law, did they think that Paul was condemning all morality, or that Paul was simply saying Gentiles don't have to follow the Mosaic code? Oh, universally, they held the latter.
Of course.
Right? That's what this refers to. So your brother's interpretation of Galatians and Romans, that Paul is somehow saying that morality itself plays no role in our right relationship to God, that position has absolutely no precedent in the Christian tradition until the 16th century. So this is Luther's idea, and it's an utter novelty, a complete theological novum, to quote Alistair McGrath. Now, Alistair McGrath is a Protestant historian. He's not a Catholic. His 2-volume History of Justification, however, comes to the conclusion that Luther's theological position was an utter novelty in the history of Christianity. So I'll go back to Galatians. I think, what is it, Galatians 1:9. If anyone preaches to you a gospel other than the one you have received for 1,500 years, let him be anathema.
There you go. Kristen, thanks for checking in from Alaska. Really wanted to get to Jose in San Antonio, but as you can hear, Jose, the music is playing. We got a boogie out the door here, so please call us back tomorrow, and we'll hopefully put you at the head of the line. Dr. David Anders, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Looking forward to our next visit, and I, too, hope that is tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. On behalf of our great team here, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you tomorrow here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.